Welcome back. In the previous video we covered Part 3, Section 1 of the NAP Handbook, Producer Eligibility. We learned about who's eligible for coverage. In this one we'll be covering Part 4, Section 1, Crop Provisions. We'll take a closer look at the crops that are covered as well as some of the special circumstances and considerations that apply. I'm going to apologize in advance. This next video is a bit of a doozy. It's pretty long, so bear with me as we go through it. When a producer signs up for NAP, they're purchasing coverage for specific crops. Some crops are very similar to one another in terms of the ways that they are grown, marketed, priced, etc. This is where the national crop definitions come into play. They are established based on similar types or varieties of a crop that have an insignificant price difference for the most predominant intended use of the crop. The acreage and production of the crop is summarized for service fee and loss calculation purposes. To identify the crop definition for service fee and payment purposes, 3 variables are included in the NAP table. The first variable is the crop's planting period. We'll discuss multiple planting periods in paragraph 206, but suffice to say, crops which have multiple planting periods are considered to have different crop definitions between these periods. In other words, all acreage planted to a single planting period for a particular crop is grouped together under a single crop definition. Acreage which is planted to the same crop in 2 or more planting periods are considered to be separate crops for service fee and loss calculation purposes. The second variable is the payment crop code. In nearly every case, all types of a certain crop will be lumped into a single payment crop code. For example, baby lima, butter, and soldier are different varieties of beans, all grouped together under the same payment crop code 0047. The final variable is known as the payment type code. This code is used to further break down specific varieties into the smallest groups, all of which share nearly identical average yields, prices, growth properties, etc. Using the bean example, we now see that baby lima, butter, and soldier beans are each considered to be different enough from one another as to be assigned different payment type codes. In the event of a crop loss, all 3 of these bean varieties would be considered separately from one another. The next 2 subparagraphs give examples of how losses are calculated in light of this procedure. In example 1, you see that the crop, lettuce, has only one type, Boston, but there are 2 different planting periods. In this example, we see that the producer has a negative payment calculated for planting period 1, meaning they do not earn a payment for this entry. Then, in planting period 2, we see a positive value calculated as $533. Because of the different planting periods, we consider these entries as being separate crops and independent from one another for loss calculations. Conversely, in the second example, we see that the crops are in the same paid crop, pay type, and planting period. In this case, the payment for $428 would be reduced by $193. If a producer requests a crop not currently eligible for NAP, the county office is to select the closest proxy from the existing crops on the crop table, but manually write in the name of the requested crop on the 471 printout. The county office should also collect data about the crop and submit it to the state office so that the specialist can request that that crop be added to the national crop table. Any request for a change to the crop definition must be submitted to the national office along with supporting data at least 120 days before the application closing deadline for the crop. Here we see the definition of a variety. On the crop table, each variety is assigned a 3-letter abbreviation. If you are unsure of the abbreviation, you can check 2CP, the NAP exhibits, or the national crop table. When reporting acreage, producers should report crops by variety and avoid lumping them all together in a single crop. Intended use is meant to help differentiate a crop for one purpose from the same crop grown for another purpose. For example, yellow corn can be grown both as forage or grain. Likewise, mixed forage can be grazed or harvested. Not every crop has multiple intended uses, but it's very important that whenever the producer completes an acreage report, the county office records the producer's intended use. Intended use can play an important role in determining payments under the NAP program. In paragraph 202b, we're first introduced to the standard rule. The standard rule is that for crop acreage reported with a specific intended use, NAP assistance will be based on the smaller of the approved average market price established for the specific intended use reported on the acreage report, or the actual market or actual use for which more than 50% of the acreage's harvested production is marketed. For example, if the producer reported his corn as intended for grain, but due to lack of quality, the producer ended up harvesting most of the crop as forage, any loss calculation would be performed using the intended use of forage because the forage value of corn is less than grain. In paragraph 203, we'll learn about something called HMP, which can be elected by producers when they sign up for NAP, and replaces the standard rule with a guarantee based on their actual historic marketing percentages. Paragraph 202C introduces another new term, secondary use. Certain crops may have multiple uses which bear little resemblance to one another. The example listed on the next page is really good at illustrating that difference. Essentially, though, when a crop is grown for one intended use, but the producer decides to instead harvest it for a totally different use, the value of that crop, which could have been harvested for the original intent, must be reduced from any payment we issue for the final use. In the example listed in paragraph 202C, we take a look at oats, which are intended as grain, but they're harvested as hay. Obviously, oat grain looks totally different than oat hay. The units of measure are different, the yields are different, and the price is different. They're grown for totally different purposes. The example shows how the value of the intended crop, grain, was assigned a value to that crop that could have been harvested, which was then subtracted from the value of the final use, hay. I realize that this sounds a little complicated, but the example in this section is actually pretty good, and the instances of applying these provisions are pretty rare, so if you come across it, take a look at the paragraph and the example. It'll help clarify. When you have a claim involving crops with different intended uses, they must be considered together when calculating the loss payment. In some instances, the different intended uses for the crop will be expressed in different units of measure. If you run into this situation and the producer does not have HMP coverage, follow the steps listed in the table below. When it comes to doing APHs for crops with different intended uses, there is an important distinction to make. There is a difference between a producer planting a crop with the intention of marketing a certain way versus a producer who is forced to market it for a use other than what they had intended. For producers who plant the crop with the intention of multiple marketing, you will keep separate APHs. However, if the producer reported on their acreage report that they planted the crop with the intention of marketing it as fresh, but due to loss of quality they were forced to market the crop as processed, you will not keep separate APHs. The key here is the phrase intended use. APHs are kept separately for each intended use and not necessarily the final uses. The only instance in which an intended use is treated as a separate crop for payment calculation purposes is the intended use of seed. Seed crops, which are recommended by the State Committee and approved by DAFP, will be grown and harvested in distinctly different manners than fresh, processed, or juice crops, and are therefore treated as separate crops. The historic marketing percentage option, or HMP, only applies to crops which are marketed in multiple ways. Tree fruit is a good example of a common HMP crop. Apples, for instance, are routinely marketed as fresh and processed. The benefit of a producer electing HMP is that it replaces the standard rule we learned about earlier. Rather than calculating losses based on how the majority of the crop is marketed, as is the case with the standard rule, HMP looks at how the crop has been historically marketed by the producer and guarantees the crop based on that ratio. Two of the biggest perks of HMP are cost and benefit. HMP does not increase a producer's premium. Additionally, the benefit a producer receives from HMP will never be less than they would be entitled to under the standard rule. In order for HMP to apply, the producer must elect HMP for the specific crop or crops at the time the application for coverage is made. In a loss year, the producer must supply their historic marketing records for the most recent 3 crop years prior to the calculation of any benefits. If the producer planted the crop in one of the previous 3 years, but fails to provide the marketing records for that year, HMP cannot be established. HMP can, however, be established for producers with histories of fewer than 3 years of marketing the crop. Historic marketing percentages are calculated according to paragraph 203C using the automated HMP calculator in the online NAP software. You'll see in this example of green beans that the producer has marketing records for 3 crop years of fresh and processed production. To calculate the HMP, the sum of fresh and processed production is divided by the amount marketed for each intended use in each crop year. The 3 years are then averaged together. These averages are the HMP. Examples 2 and 3 show how years of missing data affect HMP calculations. In addition to HMP, there's another marketing percentage called CMP, or contract marketing percentage. If the producer elected HMP coverage, they also have the option of submitting a current year's contract in order to establish their marketing percentage. The producer can decide to provide the county office with their current year contract, the 3 years of historic marketing, or both. If the producer provides both, the county office will apply whichever percentage is more beneficial to the producer. When applying a current year marketing contract, the table in subparagraph E explains how CMP is calculated. The examples that follow help illustrate all of the different variables which could come into play when calculating CMP. Once again, the calculator in the NAP software will do the math for you. Paragraph 203G explains how you determine the price to use for the crop when HMP or CMP applies. Again, the software is going to take care of this for you. A final note about HMP. These percentages can be transferred to a successor in interest in certain situations. The same is true about a number of other NAP provisions, including transfers of actual production histories, or APHs. Paragraph 204 discusses double-cropped acreage and its eligibility under NAP. Double cropping occurs when 2 separate crops are planted in succession in the same season with the expectation that both crops will be taken to harvest. This is not the same as repeat cropping or multiple planting crops. In both of these cases, the same crop is being planted more than once in the same season. In order for double cropping acreage to be eligible, county offices should refer to Handbook 2CP to establish approved double cropping scenarios for their county. In order for double cropping acreage to be eligible, county offices should refer to Handbook 2CP to establish approved double cropping scenarios for their county. The key requirements here are that the COC look at specific combinations of crops and determine that it is reasonable and practical for the combinations of the crops to be planted in the same season while allowing both crops to grow to maturity and be harvested. Only approved double cropping scenarios are eligible for NAP. Paragraph 205 talks about multiple harvested crops. By definition, a multiple harvested crop is one that is harvested more than one time in the same crop year from the same plant. The most common example of a multiple harvest crop is hay, though there are other crops which could be considered multiple harvest. With multiple harvest crops, the cumulative harvest is considered the total production for the crop. In the event of a loss, the CLA, or Certified Loss Adjuster, must not only consider the loss to the current harvest, but also the remaining potential production for the rest of the crop year. In cases where the producer wants to destroy the crop after an early season loss event, the CLA may require that the producer maintains a representative sample of the current crop so as to determine the total potential production which would be abandoned. Repeat crops mean a subsequent planting of the same crop or commodity planted on the same acreage as previous plantings of the same crop or commodity in the same planting period and the same crop year. A common example of this is lettuce, a short season crop which is often planted, harvested, and replanted in the same field multiple times in one season. Multiple planted crops are planted or prevented from being planted in more than one approved planting periods. If a county does not have approved planting periods, then the crops which are planted multiple times in the same season would fall into the category of either double cropping or repeat planting. In order to establish multiple planting periods, the COC must determine the number of plantings of a commodity that can be planted in a single season. When considering the total number of plantings, the COC must consider the total time necessary for the crop to go from planting to maturity, in addition to other factors such as average rainfall, heating degree days, and typical growing seasons. When setting multiple planting periods, the COC should refer to the chart in subparagraph D, which illustrates how plantings should be organized. You'll notice in the chart that none of these planting periods overlap one another. This is an important detail that must be observed when your county committee sets planting periods. The benefit of establishing multiple planting periods is that each planting period of a crop is considered a separate crop for the purposes of loss calculations. To help illustrate this benefit, we'll consider how a lettuce grower in a county with a single planting period is treated versus one with 3 planting periods. If a county were to have 3 planting periods for a crop like lettuce, say early, mid, and late season planting periods, and a flood in the spring were to completely wipe out the crop planted in the early season planting period, they could receive a payment on that loss immediately. In a county with only 1 planting period, however, the producer would need to wait until the end of the season before they could complete the application for payment. This is because in a single planting period, the combined production of all acreage must be reported before the loss can be calculated. To go a step further, if we assume that the producer plants the same acreage in each of those 3 planting periods, the producer in the single planting period county might not even generate a payment if only 1/3 of the total acreage was actually damaged. Direct market price option is another election choice that producers can make on their application for coverage. Direct marketing, for the purposes of NAP, refers to crops which are grown, marketed, and sold by the producer directly to consumers instead of to a wholesaler, distributor, or packer. When selling directly to consumers, the value of the crop to the farmer is greater than it would be selling to a distributor, and oftentimes the cost of producing that crop may be higher as well. The direct market price option is meant to capture that higher value and cost. Producers who elect this coverage can have payments calculated using the direct market price rather than the average market price. In order to qualify for this assistance, producers must be able to prove their percentages of crops which were sold directly to consumers as well as those through other channels. This is done in much the same way that HMPs are calculated, using the 3-year marketing history. Examples of direct marketing include sales through CSAs, farmers markets, sales directly to restaurants, roadside stands, and U-Pick operations. DMPs are set by the state committee and must be approved by DAFP. Unlike HMPs, direct market prices will affect the producer's premium. Organic producers also have special provisions under the NAP program. When signing up, certified organic growers may elect the organic option. This option will give producers the benefit of increased organic prices while considering the reduced yields observed by most organic growers when compared to conventional growing methods. To qualify for the organic option, producers must provide the county office with a copy of their certified organic system plan. Acreage and production records must be maintained and established separately for conventional and organic ground, as well as the ground that's in the process of transitioning to organic production. Organic acreage should be reported consistently with the provisions outlined in 2CP and their organic systems plan. Additionally, production evidence must be maintained separately for conventional, transitional, and organic crops. The final coverage option available to producers is the quality loss option. This applies only to specific crops. In New York, the only crops that it applies to are forage crops. Producers growing forage crops are not only affected by yield of a crop, but also by the quality of the crop. Early season cuttings will typically have greater yields in terms of quantity than other cuttings, but a loss of quality in this cutting can be a tremendous detriment to the producer. To help quantify the impact of quality at various times throughout the season, the state committee will set quality adjustment factors for each county. In order to prove loss of quality, growers must have periodic samples taken and sent off to state committee approved laboratories for testing. The cost of conducting these tests is borne by the producer. For a list of the approved laboratories, please look at the 1 NAP New York amendments. And that does it for Part 4, Section 1, Crop Provisions. We've now covered all the different options that a producer has for making elections on their 471 application for coverage. We've looked at specific crop definitions and how different cropping scenarios can be handled differently from one another. In the next video, we're going to cover Section 2, Crop Data.